Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and today is a very special day. I'm filming this on the 7th of October, which is actually President Putin's 72nd birthday. And what I wanted to do is have a look at how things have been going during his tenure. Now, he actually took over as the president back in March 2000, and he served until 2008. But at that time, there was a constitution in Russia that said that you couldn't serve for more than 2 consecutive terms. So technically, he stepped down to be prime minister and installed Medvedev as president. However, in reality, President Putin was still running the country, albeit he was called the prime minister for 4 years. Now, in 2012, he was re-elected as the president, and not surprisingly, the constitution was changed and has subsequently been elected on 2 additional occasions, the most recent being in 2024. So he's in charge at the moment until 2030, and if he's re-elected in 2030, he would actually go on to serve until he was 83 years old and would potentially overtake Joseph Stalin as one of the longest leaders in Russia's modern history. And what I wanted to do today is really focus in on what's happened since 2012, when he was re-elected as president in his current consecutive term. So we'll have a look at what's been going on with regards to the main indicators. So we'll have a look at what's happened to the value of the ruble, what's been going on with regards to GDP, what's happened to inflation and interest rates, because they're the 4 metrics that we're still being provided with by the Kremlin. As you'll know if you follow the channel, we've lost a lot of the other data that's been cut out. We're not being given detailed information as to what's happening on a daily basis in Russia. So we'll just have to have a look at those big picture metrics. And in terms of the big picture things that President Putin has orchestrated since 2012, the 2 biggest are the invasion and subsequent annexation of the Crimea area that was formerly of Ukraine and still in dispute at the moment, which took place in 2014, and then obviously the full invasion of Ukraine that started in February 2022. So we'll go through all of those metrics, and then finally today I'll finish off with my summary as to whether or not I think it's a happy birthday for President Putin or whether things aren't quite going as well as he would have liked them to by the time he hit 72. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thanks again to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really does help to keep me motivated. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much for the time and the effort and the generosity. That really means a lot to me. I see all of those messages. I do read them. Unfortunately, I don't get a chance to respond to every single one of them, but I do see them and I do appreciate it. So thanks. So let's start off by looking at GDP growth, because that's one of the main arguments put forward by people who say that Russia is doing better than the rest of the West. They say that the forecast figures for 2024 for GDP growth show that Russia is one of the strongest economies in the world. But as I've said before, you always need to look at what percentages are based upon. You need to look at the underlying figures. This chart shows the percentage year-on-year movement in GDP for Russia from 2019 out to a forecasted rate for 2029. So as you can see here, in 2019, Russia achieved GDP growth of 2.2%. It then saw a fall of 2.65% in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected all countries around the world. There was then a bounce back in 2021 as the COVID restrictions were released and all of that pent-up demand suddenly came to the fore and everybody wanted to spend. And GDP increased by just under 6% in 2021. However, in 2022, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that were applied against Russia, GDP actually contracted by 1.2%. And this was specific to Russia. This wasn't a global phenomenon. This was directly as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. Now, in 2023, the Russian economy did bounce back and achieved growth of 3.59%. And the forecast figure for 2024, put forward by the IMF, recently revised, is growth of 3.16%, so just under 3.2%. And it's this figure that a lot of supporters of Russia are using to show that Russia is doing better than the rest of the world. But the big question that I want to ask is, does that 3.2% mean that Russia is doing better than countries like the USA? This chart shows exactly the same growth figures for the USA from 2019 out to 2029. And what we can see here is that in 2019, the USA achieved just under 2.5% growth. There was then a 2.21% contraction in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The USA economy achieved a similar bounce back to Russia in 2021, seeing 5.8% growth. But the big difference on this chart is what happened in 2022, because the USA delivered GDP growth of 1.94%, compared with the 1.2% contraction that was seen in Russia. In 2023, there was further growth of 2.53%, and the latest forecast for 2024 is over 2.73% growth. As we've discussed numerous times before, you can't compare percentages. It isn't a like-for-like comparison. You need to look at what's going on with the underlying GDP. This table shows the GDP growth figures that we've just looked at for Russia and the USA. However, what I've done is added an index here to show us exactly what's going on with GDP. So what I've done here is set 2018 as the base year. So I've set the index at 100 for both Russia and the USA in that year. So if we start off by looking at the situation for Russia first, the actual GDP growth of 2.2% achieved in 2019 increased the GDP index to 102.2. However, the fall of 2.7% as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 actually took the index back to 99.5. So that means the actual GDP in Russia in 2020 was lower than it was in 2018. The 6% growth in 2021 increased the index to 105.5. We then saw another year where there was a contraction in GDP in 2022 as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, which resulted in the financial sanctions against Russia and turmoil in its trading. And at the end of 2022, the index fell back to 104.2. Now in 2023, there was 3.6% growth, and that increased the index to 107.9. But as you can see, over the 5 years between 2018 and 2023, as a result of the increases and decreases in GDP, the overall GDP only increased by 7.9 percentage points from an index of 100 at the start to 107.9. If we now look at what happened to the USA over exactly the same period, in 2019 there was 2.5% growth, which took the index to 102.5. 2020 was the COVID-19 year, so GDP fell by 2.2%, and the index fell back down to 100.2, so it was only 0.2 higher than it had been in 2018. In 2021, there was 5.8% growth, which pushed the index up to 106.1. We saw further growth in 2022 of 1.9%, which took the index to 108.1, and in 2023, the actual growth was 2.5%, and so the overall index increased to 110.9. So over that 5-year period, the USA saw an increase in its index from 100 to 110.9. If we now add on the projected growth for 2024, how the economies are expected to perform this year, the expected growth for Russia is 3.2%. And this is the figure that a lot of people are using as the comparison against other economies to prove how well Russia is doing. But as you can see, even if Russia does achieve 3.2% growth in its GDP, it will only increase its index to 111.3 over the 6-year period. If we now look at the situation for the USA, the percentage growth in 2024 is 2.7%. However, because the USA is coming from a higher base, because it's got more years of growth than Russia, it's actually increasing the index to 113.9. So that means that in the 6-year period, the USA has increased its actual GDP by 13.9 percentage points compared with 11.3 for Russia. So what this highlights is that you need to be very careful when you're comparing economies. You can't just look at the percentage growth in one individual year, because that doesn't take into account what's been happening in the previous years. And as you can clearly see, the overall growth for the USA's economy has been greater in the last 6 years than Russia's growth, despite the fact that the 2024 figures would indicate that Russia is growing at a faster rate than America. So as I said at the start of today's video, President Putin has effectively been in power in Russia since the year 2000. Technically, he stepped down and became Prime Minister for 4 years, but in reality, he's been running the show throughout. So let's have a look at what's been happening to GDP over the time that he's been in charge. But before we do that, let's have a peek at what's happened in the USA over that same period. This chart shows the annual gross domestic product for the USA economy from 1999 to 2023. And the figures on the right-hand side of this chart are shown in trillions of US dollars, and the scale goes from around $8 trillion at the bottom to $29 trillion at the top. And the reason I wanted to have a look at these figures before we look at the Russian figures is to show that the USA economy has achieved growth in virtually every single one of the last 24 years. You can see that there was a slight dip in 2009 as a result of the global financial crisis that struck all around the world, and also in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, overall, the US economy has been growing strongly throughout that period. So we haven't seen a major event that's had a long-term impact on the US economy. There have been some blips along the way, but mostly speaking, it's been year-on-year growth. If we now look at the same statistics for Russia, you can see that this chart looks very different to what we've just seen for the USA. The scale on the right-hand side of this chart is also shown in trillions of dollars. However, the figures are significantly lower. They start at 0 at the bottom and go up to 2.5 trillion at the top. And what we can see here are two distinct periods. Between 1999 and 2013, the Russian economy did achieve consistent growth. GDP fell back in 2009 and 2010 as a result of the global financial crisis. The damage to the Russian economy was far more severe than it was to the US economy that we saw bouncing back much quicker and much more strongly. However, if you look at the general shape of the chart between 1999 and 2013, there is a clear trend of rapid growth similar to the sort of shape that we looked at for the USA. And the actual GDP achieved in 2013 of $2.29 trillion was the highest in Russia's history. If we now look at what happened after 2013, in 2014 GDP fell as a result of the fact that Russia invaded Crimea and annexed that area. And in 2015 and 2016, it fell even further. And by 2016, GDP had fallen to $1.28 trillion, which represented a fall of 44% against the figure achieved in 2013. So at that point, the Russian economy was actually going into reverse. It was seeing a year-on-year fall in actual GDP. The economy did start to recover slowly in 2017, 2018 and 2019 as Russia began to cope with the sanctions that were being applied against it as a result of the annexation of Crimea. However, by 2019, the GDP was still only at $1.69 trillion, which is actually where the economy had been back in 2008, so 11 years previous. So that means that Russia really had a lost decade. It didn't see the same level of growth as was being seen in the rest of the world. GDP reduced to 1.49 trillion in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then bounced back in 21 and 22, and in 2022 it rose to $2.27 trillion, which was still less than the 2.29 trillion achieved in 2013. So in the 9 years between 2013 and 2022, there was no growth in GDP. And once again, if you compare that to what happened in the USA, you're seeing a significant difference between the two economies. The USA has had consistent year-on-year growth. Russia has seen this lost decade. And looking at these actual GDP figures really highlights the fact that you can't look at percentage movements, because if you have a particularly poor year and then you have a great recovery against that poor year, your percentage growth will look high, but your actual GDP will still be behind where it should be. And when you look at what's happened in Russia over the past 10 years, GDP is significantly down on where it would have been if Russia had decided not to annex Crimea or invade Ukraine. Inflation is one of the key metrics that we look at to see how well an economy is doing, because keeping inflation and prices in check is really important. If you have runaway inflation, if your inflation is above 10%, for example, then that means that you need to be getting pay rises above 10% just to keep your purchasing power level, and things start to get out of control. And then generally speaking, that will impact on your interest rates and the value of your currency, all of which can have a negative overall impact on your GDP. So inflation is something that we look at to see how well things have been going. So let's have a look at what's been happening in Russia over the past 10 years. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Russia dating back to September 2014. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart goes from 0% at the bottom to 19% at the top. So if we start off by looking at the situation in September 2014, inflation was running above 8% at that point. And 8% is an extremely high rate of inflation. That was the sort of level that was causing major concern in the West over the course of the last 2 years or so. But as you can see from the shape of this chart, 8% was actually quite good from Russia's perspective, because in 2015, inflation rose above 15% and remained at that level throughout the whole of the year. And this was the year immediately following Russia's annexation of Crimea, when Russia was hit with a wave of sanctions. Those sanctions were nowhere near as severe as the sanctions that have been put in place since the invasion of Ukraine. However, there were some sanctions, and it had a detrimental impact on the Russian economy. And just as a quick comparison, this chart shows the official rate of inflation in the USA over the same period. And you can see that in 2015, there was actually minimal inflation in the USA. It was running at less than 1%. During 2016, 2017 and the first part of 2018, Russia managed to get inflation under control, and it was down to around 2.5% by the middle of 2018. And interestingly, inflation in the USA at that point was at a similar level. In the second half of 2018 and the first half of 2019, inflation rose above 5%. It then came back down to around 2.5% at the start of 2020. And we then saw a steady and progressive increase in inflation as a result of the COVID-19 restrictions being released. This happened all around the world. And by February 2022, which was the month when the invasion of Ukraine started, inflation was at 9.2%. But as you can see, immediately following the invasion, inflation spiked back up again and rose to a high of 17.8% in April 2022. Inflation remained above 10% over the next 12 months, and then remarkably came back down to 2.3% in April 2023. However, over the course of the last 18 months, we've seen a rapid rise in inflation, and the most recent figure for August 2024 shows that it's currently running at 9.1%. And if you take a step back and have a look at what's been happening over the last 10 years, you can see that inflation has been a serious problem in Russia. The target level of 4% has only been achieved for a very small amount of time over the last 10 years, and for the vast majority of that period, it's been above 5%, and for periods, it's been significantly above 10%. And all of this tells us that there have been serious problems with the Russian economy over the past 10 years. Interest rates are also a key metric when looking at the success of an economy, because central banks will generally use interest rates to control inflation. If inflation is high, they tend to increase interest rates because it increases the cost of borrowing and therefore discourages companies and individuals from taking on more debt. That generally leads to a reduction in spending, and therefore demand falls and prices come back down. So before we have a look at what's been happening with interest rates over the last 10 years in Russia, let's have a look at what's been happening in the USA. This chart shows the movement in the official interest rate in the USA over the last 10 years. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart goes from minus 1% at the bottom to plus 6% at the top. The official interest rate in the USA in October 2014, 10 years ago, was 0.25%. What this chart shows is that in the 4.5 years to the middle of 2019, interest rates were increased gradually and slowly to the rate of 2.5%. We then saw the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the globe, and interest rates were reduced to 0.25%, the lowest in the US history. and they remained at that remarkably low level for almost 2 years. This was a period when it was very good to borrow money, and I know a lot of people took on mortgages, 30-year fixed-rate mortgages at very low rates, so that was a great deal for anybody that could pick them up. However, as the world came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we started to see inflation rising rapidly, and as a result of that, between February 2022 and July 2023, there was a rapid increase in interest rates to a level of 5.5%. Interest rates remained at 5.5% for more than 12 months, however have recently been reduced to 5%, and it's likely that we will see further interest rate reductions over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But if you take a step back and look at what's been happening over the last 10 years, you can see that interest rate movements, generally speaking, have been introduced relatively slowly and progressively, and the range over the last 10 years has been between 0.25% and 5.5%. If we now look at what's been happening to Russia over the same period, you can see that the shape of this chart is quite different, and so is the scale on the right-hand side. It goes from 2.5% at the bottom to 21.5% at the top. 10 years ago, in October 2014, the official rate of interest in Russia was 9.5%, and that compared to 0.25% in the USA. However, following the annexation of Crimea and the sanctions that were applied against Russia, the Russian central bank introduced an emergency rate of 17%. Over the following 12 months, that rate was reduced to 11%. And between May 2016 and June 2020, the central bank reduced interest rates on a number of occasions, and by July 2020, the interest rate was down to 4.25%, and that compares with the rate of 0.25% for the USA at that point. As Russia came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, interest rates started to rise, and by February 2022, they were back up to 9.5%. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, the central bank introduced another emergency rate of 20%. However, over the following 6 months, that rate was reduced rapidly, and by September 2022, the official rate of interest was 7.5%. Now, interestingly, as a result of the rising level of inflation over the past 18 months, the central bank has started increasing rates again, and the current official rate of interest in Russia is 19%. And this is interesting because it's the opposite of what's been happening in the rest of the world. Over the last 12 months, we've seen inflation going down in most of the developed economies, and as a result of that, interest rates have now started to reduce in a lot of countries. And if we take a step back and look at what's been happening over the last 10 years, you can see that interest rates on the whole have been at very high levels. The lowest level that they've been at any point in the last 10 years is 4.5%. However, the average rate, when you look at this chart, is somewhere around 10%. And an official interest rate of 10% is prohibitively high when you're thinking about companies and individuals borrowing to invest. And so overall, the high level of interest rates are detrimental for the Russian economy. This chart shows the movement in the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the past 10 years. And what this shows is that 10 years ago, in October 2014, one US dollar was trading for 41 Russian rubles. However, as you can see today, it's currently trading for more than 96 rubles, which means that over the last 10 years, the Russian ruble has more than halved in value. And if we look at the periods when the ruble has declined the most in value, the first period was between October 2014 and February 2016, when it reduced from 41 against the dollar to 78. And that was as a result of the invasion of Crimea and the subsequent annexation. Sanctions were applied against the ruble. A lot of countries started to pull back in terms of their trading relationship with Russia. And as a result of that, the demand for the ruble fell, and as we saw, interest rates were increased dramatically in the country and inflation also went up. Now, the sanctions that were imposed at that time were nowhere near as severe as they are now, and so the ruble began to recover. Russia was still trading with the majority of Europe, and by the end of 2017, one US dollar was trading for around 59 Russian rubles. Over the following 4 years, the value of the ruble deteriorated, and by the start of 2022, just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one US dollar was trading for around 76 rubles. The immediate impact of the invasion of Ukraine was the value of the ruble crashed, and it was trading for more than 125 against the US dollar for a short period of time. The Russian central bank then stepped in and started buying rubles to support the price, and the value actually increased to around 51 against the US dollar by June 2022, which was actually the strongest level that it traded at any point in the previous 7 years. However, the Russian central bank has been unable to keep supporting the value of the ruble, and over the last 2.5 years, the value has deteriorated again to the current level of 96 against the dollar. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because when it's a birthday, when it's a milestone, it's always nice to look back and see what you've achieved, see what's been happening over the period of your life. So in today's video, I wanted to do a recap of what's been happening in Russia over the past 24 years since President Putin has actually been president of Russia, and also what's been happening over the past 10 years. And what we've seen from today's evidence is that over the last 24 years, there have been some significant periods of problems for Russia, and most of those problems relate to invading Ukraine. The first invasion was in 2014 when the Crimea area was invaded and subsequently annexed by Russia, and obviously the second invasion took place in February 2022. And what we've seen in today's video is that when you look at the 25-year GDP position, in the period up to 2013, Russia was growing really rapidly. It was in line with where the USA was in terms of the development of its economy. However, over the last 10 years, there has been a significant setback for Russia. We've seen actual GDP falling in many of those years, and Russia still hasn't got back to where it was in 2013. And when you look at what's happened in the USA over that same period, it's achieved consistent year-on-year growth. And one of the things we've talked about in today's video is that you can't just look at percentage movements in GDP and assume that they are a similar comparison to what's happening in other countries. You need to look at what's been going on with the underlying GDP. And over the last 10 years, Russia has significantly underperformed. So even if it is achieving better percentages over the next few years, it's got to go a long way to catch up to where it should have been if GDP hadn't been falling as a result of that initial invasion of Crimea and then the subsequent invasion of Ukraine itself. And the other metrics that we've looked at in today's video also tell us that there have been serious problems in Russia. Inflation has been moving around significantly over the last 10 years, and it's had prolonged periods when it's been sitting above 10% and actually above 15% for many periods. And when you get a prolonged period like that, it starts to erode the value of your currency, and also it damages your economy. Because workers in Russia would need to have a similar pay rise to what's going on with inflation just to stand still, just to be able to put the same amount of food on the table. And that hasn't been happening historically. And also what we've seen with interest rates is that they've been up above 5% and above 10% and actually above 15% for prolonged periods over the last 10 years. And that discourages companies and individuals from borrowing, because if you're having to pay 10 or 15% as the base cost, and then you've got the bank adding their profit margin on top of that, borrowing in Russia will have been costing 15-20%. And so nobody really wants to borrow at those levels. It's loan shark levels. That doesn't really encourage anybody to go out and to invest. And of course, one of the biggest issues that we've looked at in today's video is what's been happening with the value of the ruble. The value of a currency, generally speaking, is linked directly to the strength of an economy. If your economy is doing well, generally speaking, the value of your currency will go up. And what we've seen in Russia is that over the last 10 years, there's been a significant deterioration in the value of the ruble. 10 years ago, $1 US was trading for around 41 rubles. Today, it's more than 96. So it's more than halved in value. So that isn't great in terms of Russia's imports, because everything that they're importing will now cost more than it did historically. And of course, from Russia's point of view, that's a major problem at a time when they've already got high levels of inflation. So the fall in the value of the ruble will accentuate those problems and cause even more difficulties and headaches for the Russian central bank. So the overall summary of today's video is that on his 72nd birthday, President Putin can look back at his achievements in Russia. Now, in terms of the politics of things, he's invaded Ukraine on 2 separate occasions in 2014 and 2022. The 2014 invasion resulted in the annexation of Crimea, so Russia officially controls that area that was previously owned by Ukraine. So maybe that's seen as a positive from a political perspective. The invasion of Ukraine itself that started in February 2022 has been far less successful. There are some areas that are currently occupied by Russia. However, the warfare continues. The support from the West is continuing for Ukraine, and it's likely that that war will roll on for some time. It could go on indefinitely. So that's been far less successful than the original annexation of Crimea. But when you look at what's been happening in the economy over the last 10 years, Russia has definitely lost momentum. When you compare it to what's been happening for the global economy has seen a great amount of growth over the past 10 years. We've seen some of the longest bull markets that have ever been seen in history. However, in Russia, that hasn't been happening. GDP has actually fallen in a number of the last 10 years, and the most recent figure for 2023 is still below the figure that was recorded for 2013. So Russia still hasn't caught up. And the current problems that are being seen with inflation and interest rates and the currency are likely to continue over the course of the next 3 to 6 months and potentially even longer as the financial sanctions hurt Russia and it struggles to be able to rebuild its economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.